Internal recovery work requires intense psychological focus, but clients must achieve that focus while external practical crises are actively swirling around them. Case management provides the structural framework connecting clinical treatment to a client's external reality. It is the active coordination of community agencies and resources to resolve specific identified deficits in a client's life. If an individual faces imminent eviction, pending legal charges, or a lack of basic transportation, those pressures act as immediate threats to sobriety. Unmet practical needs are one of the leading causes of relapse and treatment dropout. Human cognition prioritizes immediate physical survival. A person simply cannot dedicate the mental bandwidth required for deep psychological healing when they do not know where they are going to sleep that night. Logistical stability acts as the structural scaffolding required to make internal recovery possible. Activating a treatment plan starts with strict administrative execution. The counselor verifies the client's eligibility, confirms their continued readiness for care, and initiates contact with referring agencies to gather required assessment data. With the baseline established, the immediate next step is defining exact parameters for the treatment process. The client must understand the reality of the program on day one. This requires explicitly detailing the rules of conduct, the mandatory schedule of activities, the total financial costs, and how the intervention might alter their family dynamics. The counselor cannot assume comprehension. They must verify that the client fully understands these parameters, secure their explicit agreement to participate, and meticulously document that orientation. Establishing these rigid boundaries up front eliminates the confusion and operational friction that frequently derail clinical progress weeks later. To address a client's practical needs, the counselor must develop an exhaustive understanding of the local community's support ecosystem. This diagram maps out that ecosystem. A robust resource network spans multiple distinct sectors, clustering around medical healthcare, criminal justice agencies, public benefits offices, and housing programs. For every individual organization within those clusters, the counselor tracks precise operational data, the agency's mission, its exact eligibility criteria, and the specific protocols required to access its services. When a client requires a service that does not exist locally, exposing a gap in the network, the counselor's role expands. They must actively advocate for the creation of new resources and construct temporary bridges across fragmented systems. Maintaining this rigorous, up-to-date network turns a helpless, "I don't know where to send you," into a concrete, immediately executable plan. When a specific resource is identified, the counselor initiates a referral. This is the exact matching of a client's identified need to a specific available support system. A valid referral requires clinical precision. The counselor factors in the client's cultural background, transmits accurate documentation using proper forms, and executes a verified follow-up to confirm the connection was established. Handing a client a phone number, a cold referral, yields low compliance. By contrast, a warm handoff, where the counselor makes the initial contact or physically introduces the client to the receiving provider, drastically improves follow-through. Throughout this process, strict confidentiality protocols apply. Information is shared only with explicit, valid consent, and disclosures are limited to the absolute minimum necessary to achieve the referral's purpose. The counselor's active participation in the handoff remains the primary variable in determining if a client actually utilizes a referral. Complex cases rarely involve a single clinician. A client might simultaneously report to an addiction therapist, a psychiatric prescriber, a primary care physician, and a probation officer. The case manager serves as the central coordination hub among these disparate disciplines. Operating effectively here requires the counselor to understand the specific terminology, legal procedures, and professional roles of each distinct agency. Coordination requires continuous, structured communication. The counselor synthesizes the client's background, solicits clinical feedback from the multidisciplinary team, and modifies the overarching treatment plan based on those cross-system inputs. Every interaction carries external weight. Because the counselor represents the client to outside agencies, their professional demeanor and non-judgmental attitude directly dictate how both the individual and the treatment program are perceived in the community. Centralizing this communication ensures quality continuity of care, eliminating the contradictory instructions, duplicated efforts, and dropped responsibilities that otherwise fracture a client's recovery. Depending on the client's baseline needs and the program's structure, the intensity of this coordination shifts. Case management utilizes 4 distinct models of delivery. This diagram illustrates the brokerage model. Here, the counselor acts primarily as an assessor, identifying deficits and passively linking the client to external services. The strengths-based model changes the dynamic. The focus shifts toward the client's internal assets, guiding them to use their own strengths to secure resources and build self-directed autonomy. For clients presenting with complex, high-friction profiles, the intensive model deploys a counselor with a deliberately small caseload to provide frequent, highly involved logistical support. Finally, the clinical model integrates logistical case management directly into the core therapeutic relationship itself, dissolving the boundary between clinical counseling and administrative coordination. Across all 4 models, the operational intensity scales to match the deficit, but the structural objective remains identical, organizing external care entirely around the client's internal goals. Even with a perfectly executed referral, clients frequently collide with dense bureaucracies and rigid eligibility requirements. Case management requires active advocacy to help navigate these obstacles. Valid clinical advocacy must remain strengths-based. The counselor prioritizes the client's own skill development, teaching them how to negotiate with housing authorities or complete benefit applications, rather than simply executing the tasks for them. This introduces a strict clinical tension. The counselor must constantly calibrate the balance between providing active, immediate intervention to solve an urgent crisis and stepping back to foster the client's own independence. There are 2 distinct failure states here. Doing too much for the client fosters long-term systemic dependence. Doing too little under the guise of autonomy leaves a vulnerable individual completely stranded. The goal of advocacy is a gradual transfer of power. The objective is equipping the individual with the systemic literacy necessary to confidently manage their own affairs long after formal treatment concludes. Routine interagency coordination inherently generates recurring risks of unauthorized data disclosure. 42 CFR Part 2 enforces strict parameters, isolating substance use treatment records from unauthorized access. Counselors cannot disclose identifying information with explicit written consent, restricted to the minimum data required. Counselors track exact consent expirations, and receiving agencies are prohibited from redisclosing data. When a client is justice involved or receiving wraparound services from child welfare and medical providers simultaneously, these consent frameworks compound into a highly complex legal matrix. Navigating this matrix requires continuous precision. The ethical boundary is absolute. The logistical need to coordinate care never overrides a client's legal right to privacy.